I am joined on stage with two people you probably have already become familiar with, but just in case, why don't you guys kick off by doing introductions? Mark, you go first.
Okay. All right, thank you. It is my favorite jacket, actually.
I love it. It's a beautiful jacket.
Yeah, so I'm Mark. I run product and go-to-market for Anjuna Security. We're a company that helps enable very frictionless confidential computing. But I'm also the co-chair of the Cloud Security Alliance Confidential Computing Working Group. And so that's an entity you're probably familiar with. The Cloud Controls Matrix comes from them. We do work to educate the industry and also sometimes influence regulatory controls frameworks as well. Brittany.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brittany Kaiser. I'm the CEO of Alpha Compute, NASDAQ ALP. I am also a data rights activist that sits on multiple U.S. congressional committees on fintech, digital innovation, technology, and ethics. I've helped co-author over 60 different bills that we've passed in the U.S. on data protection, privacy, and digital asset ownership. And I spend a lot of time in Congress, so excited to dive deeper into regulatory topics.
Great. So let's start off with why are regulators beginning to focus on protecting data while it is being processed rather than only at rest in transit? Brittany, you want to go first?
Well, it's because finally our legislators and regulators realize that they have to get a little more technical in order for legislation to actually be implementable. Over the past decade, I have spent probably tens of thousands of hours with legislators and regulators really getting into the definitions of not just data, but how all of these technologies function and what are all of the risks at different parts of the data processing cycle. And a lot of the legislation that started to be passed about 8 years ago, like GDPR and some of the early privacy acts in the United States, were not actually technical enough in order to have a technology solution that would allow you to be compliant. And I think that has been one of the biggest issues that I have dealt with over the past decade, really working with legislators and regulators, is how do we work more closely with technologists in the space that can really get down to the bottom of how the data processing functions so you can identify all of those risks and make sure that the law actually addresses each of those items. And whether it's just going to be legislation or it's going to be the way that regulatory bodies look at this or standard setting, we need to make sure that we get as technical as possible so that we can actually protect end users.
Yeah, I would comment too that there are some regulations that automatically require you to have data in use protection to some extent, but it doesn't tell you how, typically. GDPR is one of those. It's the privacy of processing, and then we've got all sorts of data minimization requirements. There's others like PCI DSS that was always about processing data, but it doesn't explicitly call out protection of data in memory unless it persists. So there are clauses in PCI DSS that specifically call it out. But I think one of the things that I want to sort of surface here, we've got some slides. If we can just bring up the slide deck up here. So one of the things that I track as part of both the CSA and my job at Anjuna is to look for regulatory changes and mentions. And so one of the things we have, by the way, is a call to action for each and every one of you. Don't wait for regulations. Be a part of the process of helping them get there. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But if you look at this chart here, so this is a kind of a survey that we did, which was the kind of the mentions of trusted execution environments or data in memory. Basically 5-6 years ago, nothing, just trickles of information there, and in some of the latent regulations like GDPR, PCI DSS, etc. But I don't know why I do this, but I sit there in the evening scanning for regulations. How boring is that sounding? But it's actually pretty exciting when you're in our industry. But we've seen a rise of mentions of trusted execution environments, secure enclaves, data and use protection, privacy-enhancing technologies, and all of these kind of fall into that same bucket. And so to your point, Aaron, about why do we need this? I think the regulators usually respond to industry issues. And I've got an example of one of those coming up just to kind of show you this, that's from NIST. But at the end of the day, we've seen continued attacks to systems. Despite all of the software rings we apply around software, around critical software, the attacks persist, and the regulators pay attention to that. And so, even with regs like GDPR, which says use state-of-the-art technologies, we've seen regulatory mentions of TEs and so on just keep on rising. And so what you need is a foundation of standards, which then is referenced by the regulatory bodies, and then the enforcement. And I don't think there's any reg that's going to say, use a TE or else, but they will certainly imply you've got to start thinking about data and use protection because of the kinds of risks that are there. So I think there's a really interesting trend, and we'll continue to see this go up. To me, this is signals for organizations to be ready. So get ready with confidential computing and technologies like it to be there when the regs do hit, because otherwise that point is just too late in time.
So you mentioned GDPR, and one of the interesting things around GDPR and TEEs is that there was a recent change in Sweden, I think, where it requires processing of GDPR data inside of a TEE. So I expect we'll probably see more of that proliferate.
Yeah, well, Sweden has always been ahead of the curve. Sweden was the first country to have a government cybersecurity certificate, a standard that was set by the government. And you could go through a program in order to get that certificate. And if you were a company, you got the golden stamp of approval from the government saying your data is safe with these companies. So, of course, all of the companies that got those first cybersecurity certificates were booming with business because all of a sudden there is some sort of trust standard in how organizations are dealing with data. And I've done a lot of cybersecurity trainings and data ownership and privacy trainings with the Swedish government. I go out there all of the time, and they really are leading. We actually have loads of GPU deployments that we're doing in Sweden at the moment, which we're very excited about. And I think a lot of people in the Swedish government have really, really focused on making sure that they can be a thought leader in data protection and privacy. And this absolutely didn't surprise me when they put that forward.
There's also the Swedish chef. Let's recognize him. Bjork, Bjork, Bjork. Which emerging regulation standards or industry frameworks are most likely to accelerate adoption of confidential computing over the next 3 years?
So I've just happened to have a slide on that one, Aaron.
Fantastic.
So again, part of this kind of the monitoring of what's going on, the TE mentions, yeah, we often get asked, hey, why aren't there regs that could kind of really drive towards this? Well, there are emerging, and some of those conversations are in the United States. If you look at, for example, DoD zero trust architecture guidance, confidential computing, isolation mechanisms are referenced there. NSA brought out guide recently on the version 2.0 for zero trust, again referencing trusted execution environments. It doesn't go into the details, but it's that first stage of recognition that this kind of technology is an acceptable control mechanism for mitigating risks and to implement strategies like zero trust more broadly. So, that we won't go into them here. There's the Sweden one on there, the IMY, which is a great shift.
You're so prepared, Mark.
Indeed. But there's two here that I highlighted as for kind of examples of where things are starting to emerge. So. Just recently, in the last month, ETSI, which is the European Telecom Standards, I can't remember what it is, the ISE Institute, yes, brought out a kind of an early stage guidance for confidential AI. And in there, it actually goes into quite a bit of technical detail about the instrumentation of trusted execution environments to provide isolation and trust guarantees. Now, that's a standard, it's not necessarily a reg, but again, it's that recognition of frameworks in industries where risk, compliance, complexities of managing attacks needs to be upper level than where it is today. So this is a kind of a sampling of kind of mentions of data and use mechanisms. Some countries are quite ahead, like the UK, for instance. The US has certainly been active too, and there's a couple of examples of the NIST ones I'll show a little later today as well.
By the way, we have Anna Tallis from the European the author of GDPR and EU AI Act, who's going to broadcast in at the closing session some words about regulation. I reached out to her, and she was unfortunately committed to speak at some governmental event and couldn't make it in person. And she'll be zooming in though from at the closing. So next question.
I haven't seen her in years.
Well, I just met her, and she was very lovely. So can confidential computing reduce compliance complexity by satisfying multiple regulatory requirements through a common control framework?
I think the answer to that is kind of a yes, but it's also a yes with an asterisk on it. So the way I kind of look at this is many of the regs here often revolve around data minimization, right? So try to avoid collecting information, which is in direct contrast with the AI agenda of most organizations, which want to vacuum up every single piece of data and somehow monetize that. But if you look at things from a regulatory controls perspective across most kind of mechanisms for isolation or minimization, what it tends to come down to is, number one, about kind of the data, and there's things like consent in there as well, obviously, from a privacy perspective. But from a technical controls perspective, even if you look at something like PCI DSS, the way you assess the environment that's in scope of PCI is to look at things like the network segments, the presence of cardholder data, or the systems that can process and access that. And so we've taken a view for many years of putting scope inside an area where it might be a boundary around a network. Now, with confidential compute, you can shrink that boundary to the processor. So all of a sudden, you've taken a lot of this other stuff out of scope of potential regulatory compliance. And that's actually where the value is. You're not eliminating everything, you're shrinking the footprint of the things that you have to worry about. So instead of worrying about an adjacent system that happens to be right next door on a compute plane that's open, that is accessible, which would be in scope, and therefore you have to have 256 different controls in order to meet compliance, you can basically say, look, this is the domain that's in scope, and I can prove that. And the beauty of confidential computing, it lets you attest to that. It's not just sampling and providing a document and a point in time. You can prove it, and then on an ongoing basis, keep proving that. So there's work still to be done to bring the kind of regulatory bodies and the assessors who actually look at the compliance frameworks up to speed on this stuff. But I think we've started to see a groundswell with this activity here, which is very encouraging.
Yeah, absolutely. I would completely agree with that. As I'm engaging with different types of regulated industries, from finance and banking to healthcare to government and military, I'm seeing more and more that the demand for confidential compute is really to reduce risk and make compliance so much easier. Exactly as you said, you're reducing the amount of risk vectors because you are fully technically and mathematically provably owning all of your data and not sharing it with third-party systems, where then you need to think about, well, is it tens of or is it hundreds of third-party systems that actually get access to this data throughout my stack? No, it's 100% yours, and you can show that and attest to that. So I think, especially for HIPAA compliance and for military purposes, and I'm seeing this with a lot of big banks that haven't even implemented AI yet because they literally can't get it approved by their compliance departments, that if they are starting to experiment with trusted execution environments and confidential computing, that all of a sudden they're able to use AI for the first time because it's the only way that they're able to get that type of approval internally.
So I think most of this just gets automated. And what I mean by that is what I observe is we're enforcing policies as code at the workload or agent graph and the container. So I'm sure most people know what I'm talking about who are here. Enforcing policy as code that are contractual terms. There are frameworks for this, like ORDL, that you can implement contractual terms as code and then provide hardware-attested verifiability of those policies being enforced. So the thing I'm saying is, I think most of this policy compliance complexity gets automated away because we can embody it as actual code that then goes through the attestation process and produces a cryptographic measurement. And then, like for Opaque, and I'm sure Anjuna does this with your new watchtower, I'm sure, where you can output, you can emit like, oh, well, here's all of the controls that have been cryptographically enforced inside the runtime for a particular agent. It's a natural step that Anjuna's watchtower, Opaque, agent control with our confidential core would emit proof of the policy's enforcement that were contractual requirements, for example. It's just a natural step.
You're getting to the point where you have to use automation and AI to keep a grip on this because the scale and the volume and the complexity is high. If you look at even just this, right? So if you're an enterprise, this is just a very small sampling of regulatory bodies that probably have several different control frameworks that need to be then instrumented. And then you've got the business level contracts on top of that. How could you keep on top of that just with a human? So it absolutely has to be. And then you've got to think about, well, how do I trust that?
Yeah,
So
especially if you have,
got
it's
another
not just
challenge.
about the humans that are executing and touching things that would be governed by specific policies. What happens when you have swarms of tens of thousands of agents operating at machine speed, being able to process, petabytes of data in a matter of minutes or hours? Right, that's when
Yeah.
you have to automate this, right? And good news is we've got like DSLs. You can actually map a human language and contracts into policies that gets turned into code and then goes through an attestation from a cryptographic root of trust in the hardware. Brittany,
Yeah,
go ahead.
absolutely. I mean, in the end, this conversation in the age of AI is about permission structures. It's not about data minimization, because in the end, these systems want as much data as possible. So it's, how do we secure those permission structures? How do we know that data that is not supposed to be shared with other parties or into different parts of the system is not being shared? How can you prove that? It's one of the reasons why I've worked on smart contracts and on decentralized technologies for 15 years, because smart contracting and being able to have self-executing contracts where you know exactly where the data is going and where you can, when it self-executes, the data is no longer accessible. That's something that, confidential computing also allows similar types of mechanisms where you can prove that the data hasn't gone where it's not supposed to go. And for compliance and auditing purposes, I mean, as a public company or in any other regulated industries, this is just absolutely essential.
How are AI governance, data sovereignty, and third-party data sharing driving new interest in TEEs and confidential computing?
I think we've covered some of that. I think it comes back to that kind of scale problem, right? So, one of the things we've been looking at as well, and it comes back to kind of what you were talking about with, what can you govern? When you actually look at what goes back and forwards from agents to LLMs, there's the things that you control, like prompts and stuff like that, that you have visibility into, but there's a whole gamut of other things that happen behind the scenes that you don't. And it's sometimes kind of shocking what data actually ends up, even in just an LLM itself. So first of all, you've got to ask the question, well, how do I stop having things that I don't expect going into environments that I don't control and still have the capability to have the mission complete, the LLM still providing that kind of value. So that's kind of one issue. But then there's the question of, okay, well, what about the LLMs themselves, the services? What am I putting into that? I think there's a general mixture of both massive hope with AI and also massive fear. And we're in that sort of V-shaped kind of area which we have to solve for in order to completely unleash it. So there's a very natural pairing between making AI fully scalable and meeting the needs of enterprises and also meeting the needs of privacy from a consumer perspective.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I'm a techno-optimist. I do believe that we're building these systems to vastly improve everyone's lives and make everything more efficient. And, like the late, great Dr. Stephen Hawking used to say, we build technology to live in luxurious leisure. And what he meant by that is the technology is supposed to do all the grunt work so we can concentrate on our passions. But if we don't realize the negative consequences of what these tools can possibly cause and reduce those risks as much as humanly or technically possible, then we can, be in quite a mess. And I've experienced that myself in the past. So in order to reduce data breach risk and lack of compliance risk, and in general doing damage to our clients and end users, we need to make sure that we are implementing confidential systems where we have mathematical proofs that we know that nothing is being done with the data that we didn't want it. It's not getting in places where it shouldn't be. And in the end, overall, that means we're going to be able to do more and more experimental and exciting work with these technologies, because we will be able to get it approved by compliance and implemented into our daily lives.
We have more questions here. Are there any specific ones you guys want to ask, or can we open it up to the audience to ask some questions?
Yeah, let's do that, because I think we've covered a few topics.
And I will give you prizes if you ask questions. I have cool prizes for you if you ask questions. So I'll give you guys, I'll ask one more question just so that you can get together your thoughts and courage to raise your hand, and I'll walk over a mic. How does agentic AI change things for organizations?
Yeah, I think we've touched on that a little bit, but there's this. It comes back to that sort of dilemma. You've got massive pressure on organizations to tap into agents and the power. You've also got the kind of the dilemma, which is, hang on a minute, there's all sorts of the security risks that we need to think about that are completely new because of the non-determinism and so on and so forth. We've started to see, organizations like NIST start to address that. In fact, this standard that's actually in public comment period was all about, it was driven from the risk to the kind of some agentic breaches that took place. So this is a reaction from NIST to kind of token theft, which is just all about access control at the end of the day, but it becomes an even more problematic scenario for agents. So what I loved about this is that I saw, the deck that and the presentations that NIST produced were about the origins, mentioning agentic security risks, but bringing confidential computing to the fore as a control for at least managing things like credentials and keys and so on. It's kind of like good bread and butter stuff, but it's the first time I'm seeing confidential computing being mentioned as a mechanism. And NIST are also saying, efforts are underway. Look, keep an eye out here because we're going to be talking about this agentic problem. And so we've got a standards body here really leaning in on this. So it changes the game. It has to happen quick though, because otherwise industry is just going to move on and do whatever they can to make this happen.
Yeah, I've already seen organizations and individuals, especially implementing AI agents into more and more sensitive data sets. And so we're seeing new types of security risks that have never existed before, where you have one system that has access to absolutely all of your data sets, both for your commercial life as well as your personal life. And when you're having everything from private messages to emails to all of your public presence and public and private communications for work and for your own life, all in one spot, you can imagine what that actually looks like when your agent falls subject to malicious prompting. So I think we're seeing much higher security risk and breach risk than ever before, and therefore I'm not surprised to see that NIST is suggesting confidential computing as a way to actually think about what is the standard to make sure we can protect people when implementing these technologies.
Great, we've got a question from the audience. Start with your name and your hometown.
Yeah, good afternoon. This is Venkat from Dallas. Yeah, it's a great conference. Thanks for organizers and Linux Foundation and Opaque and Alpha Computing. My question is there any collaborative confidential computing or the roadmap to where major players or globally where they could benefit from? You see a lot of standards, right? On the previous one of the slides, standards all over. For example, since I work in financial space, we work on GDPR, and then recently even RBI, Reserve Bank of India, enforcing protecting their customer data. And I was in AI Summit in Delhi last Feb, I think. Yeah, it was in Feb, and largest conference, and all big weights were there. So how does in general, the simple question is, collaboratively we win or protect the data at large globally? Is there any roadmap that you see happening?
You guys want to jump in? I mean, I could we made some announcements. I'll start with that. So yeah, I think that you see how everybody individually, within large tech, have built their own stacks and policies and enforcement to enforce and verify this inside large tech companies, or inside large financial services companies are kind of rolling their own. I think that the next stage here is how do you create interoperability between these and standardize these, which is why Opaque released Agent Trust, which was a collaboration across Microsoft, Anthropic, Intel, NVIDIA, AMD, and a bunch of others. And we should work together to determine, hey, how do we make these governance rules, how do we make verifiable governance portable so that you can have a portable record that you can examine before distributing a workload or sharing data? So there's absolutely work underway around that. Like Agent Trust is one governance record that's portable, which all it does is take a bunch of existing standards like Skit, Salsa, Eats, a whole bunch of stuff, and then package it into an envelope that then anybody could process and use as a passport. So I think that's probably the highest impact area right there, is breaking down the walls where individuals are rolling their own stacks and making it portable. But Mark, Brittany?
Yeah, there's other ways to collaborate as well. As on the standards themselves. So that, the samples of the bodies that I mentioned there, these are still very early stages in many cases, right? It's often a technical standard that then has to be incorporated into a regulation. I'll jump ahead. There's a couple of examples of those, but for example, the CCC, the group that's sponsoring this event, also has collaborative working groups for governance, risk, and compliance. And the purpose of those is to influence standards bodies as well. So I would strongly encourage getting engaged at that level, which is all about really kind of very vendor-neutral approaches to kind of collaboration on enablement standards. There's the Cloud Security Alliance too. That's the group that I chair. We're producing technical documentation and white papers on
How'd you
education.
get the slide done betwing him asking the question and you like?
Yeah, I know.
What the hell, man?
This is what AI does for you.
This is amazing. And then also your accent is so authoritative.
Yeah, I'm
Please
actually
keep going.
originally from New Jersey. I learned this accent.
Like a proper English accent. Keep going.
Right. But, again, there's work on things like open source, but then there's the actual organizations that can influence standards group as well. So, if anybody here in the US also wants to comment, there's an open comment period right now with NIST. I'm not representing NIST here by any means, but it's one that's worth looking at, which is again, a kind of a technical guidance on confidential AI. The public comment period is open until July the 13th. And it doesn't have to be you analyzing it and saying, hey, I'm critiquing this particular attestation thing, this register's wrong. It's not about that. It's about just saying, this is so important for industry. We fully support this as a company, and putting those letters to NIST, and there's a process for that, because that's the groundswell that then drives the adoption and further investment, because NIST then sees signals from the market. So that's really, really important.
I'd also say that some of the most interesting collaborative projects that you can get involved in to be a part of this roadmap are more on the technical side, not just legislative, regulatory, and standards. We at Alpha Compute invest a lot in open source R&D. I'm a huge open source advocate. There are tons of open source projects where you can get your team involved, jumping in and making commits and doing GitHub pushes and actually building out some of the interoperability and accessibility of confidential computing. We are actually listing a lot of those projects on our website. Besides Alpha Compute, I'm also the founder and president of the Open Source AI Foundation. We're a 501c4 based in Washington, D.C., and so we advocate for the use of open source as the main way for a lot of these problems to be solved collaboratively. So we'll definitely be listing those, so you can check on our website for that as well, and for things that you can get involved with.
Cool. We've got 1 minute and 27 seconds remaining. What evidence or assurance mechanisms do regulators need to trust confidential computing as a compliance control?
Firstly, they need to be educated. So, it's not always about the technical piece. If you look at the kind of the level of education of confidential computing is tracked with that compliance curve of mentions and so on. So I think we're getting much, much better about that knowledge, but it has to then translate down to the people on the ground that sign off on whether it's an automated report or a manually generated one. So I think part of the challenge is just the education piece on this. That's why getting involved is actually important, and spreading the goodness.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's education and awareness, and unfortunately, some of this is generational. We did not grow up being taught how technology functions, just how to use it. And so I think this is going to take, 5 to 10 years before the entire world actually understands some of these concepts. But unfortunately, it's going to be over the next few months where everyone's touching AI. So that's an incredibly dangerous gap. And so I think making confidential computing as accessible as possible, as quickly as possible, where it's invisible in the back end and people don't need to know to ask for it, is one of the main things that we should all be concentrating on doing.
Okay, thank you guys so much for your time. And Mark, I'm thank you so much, because you audibled and jumped on this, and you were just terrific. I mean, hell, you had all these great slides put together. It's a
They're
miracle.
amazing.
It's amazing.
Yeah, just if anybody wants a copy of the report, let me know as well. That's just a survey
Yes,
of industries.
please.
Yeah.
And what's your phone number, Mark? They can call you.
555-555.
All right, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.